Hello, my name is Adam Gawlikowski, and welcome to Leadership in Life. Our first session is on the subject of communication, which is something we do pretty much every waking moment of our life. However, too often miscommunication occurs when we send a message to a person and we think they're going to do something and they do something different. And this happens because the biggest problem with communication is the assumption of it. This video will challenge you to improve your communication skills, and you can do that by practicing the art of giving and demanding feedback from the people with whom you communicate. At the end of this video, we'll be asking you to email me examples of how this information has actually helped you improve your communication skills. Now let's begin by looking at the art of communication. Now, communication is not a pure science, but it can be structurally represented in the following model. The perfect communication begins when the sender sends a message to a receiver. The receiver then interprets the message and feeds back to the sender what the receiver believed the message to be. Then the sender clarifies by providing feedback to the receiver that the message was understood. And this is what happens in a perfect communication. However, an integral part of the communication model not seen is the fact that both the sender and the receiver come from different backgrounds. And we don't know what their backgrounds are, but we know that their backgrounds have influenced how they communicate. There are many, many, many examples and things that influence our communication depending on our background. But let's talk about a couple of them. Number one, family and position. Another one, gender, education, economic status, religion, ethnicity, travel, and music. All of these things, the abundance of which we have or the lack of which we have, influences how we communicate. So now that we know how the model works and whether or not the influences make sense, we often then don't even know who we're talking to. We could be talking to a person who has similar influences that we do, and when we do have that conversation, communication usually works well. However, when we're talking with a person who has different influences in their background, communication can suffer. This is an example of what I call a perfect communication. In this example, the boss says, "Mike, would you please prepare the conference room for the meeting we have scheduled tomorrow morning?" Mike responds, "Okay, boss, I'll set it up in the classroom style like we had for the last meeting." And the boss responds, "Perfect." In the second example, the boss says, "Mike, would you please prepare the conference room for the meeting we have scheduled tomorrow?" And again, Mike responds, "I'll be happy to, boss. I'll set it up in the classroom style like we had for the last meeting." But this time the boss says, "No, Mike, I'd like it set up in a horseshoe style." Both these examples of perfect communication identify four things: sending, interpreting, giving feedback, and clarifying. The sender sent the message, the receiver interpreted it, fed back to the sender fed back to this receiver whether or not the message was understood. And that's how communication works in a perfect world. However, we don't live in a perfect world, and miscommunication happens. Thus again, it happens because the biggest problem with communication is the assumption of it. Let me explain how communication works. The sending part is really quite easy. All we do is open our mouth and blurt out words. We don't even often think of what we're going to say. We just simply say it, and out it comes. However, listening is a little bit different. Listening, the first part, is really pretty easy. In fact, it's automatic. I don't care how the message is phrased. I don't care how the words are garbled. I don't even care if it's in a different language. The receiver will always interpret the message being sent by the sender. However, the second part, feeding back to the sender, is where communication absolutely shuts down. In the example with Mike, the boss said, let's say the boss says, Mike, would you please prepare the conference room for the meeting we have scheduled tomorrow? And this time Mike says, okay, boss. Well, in that dead silence, the boss gets a feeling something's wrong. And the boss is usually going to say, Mike, are you sure you know what I want you to do? And Mike, of course, is going to respond, oh yeah, boss, I'm sure. And then the boss might ask that extra clarifying question, do you have any questions? And Mike's going to say, no. This example is almost exactly like the group situation, where you have a speaker come in and the speaker makes a presentation, and as the presentation finishes, the speaker says, okay, does everybody understand what they're supposed to do? And everybody responds, yeah. And then the speaker says, does anybody have any questions? And everybody says, no. And then the speaker walks out, and the people look at each other, and one of them says, do you know what we're supposed to do? It is amazing how people will ask other people questions, but they won't ask the speaker. And do you know why? I'm sure you do. It's because we feel that if we were to ask a question, we would be viewed by everybody in the group and the speaker that we are stupid. And by the way, in the example with Mike, Mike thought he knew the boss wanted the conference room set up in the classroom style. And you know what? Mike thought wrong. Conversely, the boss thought Mike knew to set it up in the horseshoe style, and you know what? The boss thought wrong. So, the hard reality is that when we think we know something, what do we actually know? Nothing. However, how often do we act on an I think I know? And then we're wrong. What do we say? Well, I thought this, or I thought that. And quite frankly, we thought wrong. Now, my question to you is, how do we turn an I think I know into I know? And you know the answer. We ask. But that's the very thing we don't do. And do you know who taught us not to ask, by the way? Oh, I know who it is, and you do too. It was that one time when you asked a clarifying question and that person said to you, that's a stupid question, what did you ask that for? From then on, we made a vow never to ask another question because we didn't want to put ourselves in a position where we would appear to be stupid. But I got to take a time out here because I got to ask you to do something. When somebody does ask you a clarifying question, and they will, before you answer that clarifying question, please say to that person, you know, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. When you compliment a person who has the courage to ask you a clarifying question, you will, number one, encourage more questions. Number two, you will clarify understanding. And number three, you will guarantee success in that communication. However, going back to getting feedback, feedback is really like pulling out teeth. In fact, I have a better analogy. Pulling out feedback is so important that what I'm recommending we do is rip it out of a person just about the same way the evil character in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom did when he ripped the heart out of a sacrificial enemy. When a receiver does not offer feedback, we have to demand it. The importance of feedback is so critical because without it, we really never know what the receiver is going to do. So let me tell you this. There are two basic ways to get feedback from a receiver. The first is what I like to call the side door method. In this method, the sender simply asks the receiver, would you please tell me how you're going to perform this task? And obviously, when the receiver tells how the task is going to be performed, the sender then figures out whether or not the receiver understood the message. The second method is what I like to call going to the throat. In this method, the sender simply says, would you please repeat back what I've asked you to do? Now, this method can be awkward because the question suggests that the receiver doesn't understand the message, and then the receiver becomes defensive, and then the receiver is going to say something like, "Hey, Adam, I know what I'm supposed to do. I don't have to repeat it back to you." And when somebody says that to me, I generally back off, and I say, "Okay," and I let them go. And when they go, I cross my fingers and hope that they got the message correct. But here's my big question. How many times have you let a person go without demanding feedback, thinking that you knew they knew what to do, and they were wrong? 20%? 30%? 40%? 50%? And by the way, what is the value for them not being wrong? What is the value for them getting it right the first time and not having to repeat it? Well, the value is huge and easily measured in bottom line profit. My recommendation to get feedback from a person is to go to your own throat with a soft grip and simply say to the person this statement: "You know, I'm not sure that I use the right words to explain exactly what I want you to do, so could you please help me by repeating back what I've asked you to do?" Using this method will put emphasis on you, the speaker, as a sender, and not the listener as a receiver. As promised, I'm going to ask you to practice the following behaviors. First of all, as a receiver, remember that you have two functions. The first is to interpret what the sender says, and the second is to willingly provide feedback back to the sender what you believe the message to be. Secondly, as a sender, remember that when the receiver does not willingly provide feedback, remember to demand feedback by either using the side door method or the going to your own throat method. And as a sender, when the receiver does have the courage to ask you a clarifying question, before you answer, please say to them, "Hey, that's a great question. Thanks for asking." Now, I'd like to ask you to please practice these behaviors for 7 days. And at the end of that time, please share your experiences in an email to me at adamg@appliedleadershipservices.com. Finally, tell your friends about this video and ask them to watch it.